Hello, my name is Brandy Shufutinsky, and I'm a board member of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Welcome to this live stream production of Woke Media with our very special guest, Batya Ungar-Sargon. The Jewish Institute for Liberal Values fights for the free expression of ideas and against the imposition of ideology, both inside and out of the Jewish community. We educate the Jewish community on the dangers of critical social justice ideology, particularly in how it fuels antisemitism. We organize key constituencies, such as rabbis, academics, and Jewish professionals in these efforts. We conduct advocacy campaigns, and we work in common cause with important non-Jewish segments to advance an open society and democratic values. I'm excited to hear from Batya Ungar-Sargon, who recently came out with a groundbreaking book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, which has gotten tremendous attention in the past few months. Batya is the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek. Before that, she was the opinion editor of The Forward. She has written for the New York Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, the New York Review of Books Daily, and other publications. Speaking with Batya this afternoon is my fellow JILV board member, Rebecca Roythe. Rebecca is the trustee professor of law and co-dean for faculty development at New York Law School. She teaches criminal law and ethics and writes about the importance of neutral legal institutions and principles to American democracy. Her opinion pieces on prosecution, legal ethics, and politics have appeared in Slate, the New York Review of Books Daily, Politico, and the Washington Post. She is the legal news contributor for CBS News and appears as an expert on MSNBC and CNN.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here, and I am thrilled to be speaking with you, Batya, about your book, which I just loved. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor for me. I really respect what the Institute is doing. Dr. Shufutinsky, thank you so much for that introduction. I can't stress enough how much your moral leadership, your moral courage means to me at this time. I think that so many of us feel the lack of moral leadership and courage. So whenever I see it, I feel there's a sense of relief. I think, I'm so desperate to see it. So thank you all so much for having me. I'm really, really, really honored to be here. I hope I made that clear.
You totally did. And I took your book with me on vacation, I have to tell you, and it was such a conversation starter. Like, I had so many friends and enemies by the end of my vacation because of your book, which was fantastic. But anyway, I want to just start off by asking you, your book, the essential argument is that this particular ideology, which you refer to as woke ideology, has taken over mainstream media. So I was wondering if you could just explain what you mean by that. What do you mean by woke ideology, and in what way has it infiltrated our media or the mainstream of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. If a liberal publisher had agreed to publish my book, it probably would not have had the word woke in the title. So it's funny, but I'm willing to defend it because I think it is an accurate word for what I'm describing. So let me first start by saying what I don't mean when I'm talking about wokeness. I'm not referring to the very important work people are doing to fight the remaining areas of systemic racism in America, right? It's not woke to demand police reform. We really need police reform. It's not woke to demand an end to mass incarceration. We really need mass incarceration. President Trump wasn't being woke when he passed the First Step Act and released 5,000 Black men from prison, right? He was being a good American. So to me, wokeness is it's not a reference to the really important fight that's going on right now for racial justice, a fight that it bears mentioning and repeating over and over is no longer a partisan one. So, President Trump and before him, many Republicans before him did more on the criminal justice reform front than any Democrats had in about a decade. They've been at the forefront. Of course, not for reasons that many progressives would recognize. Most of it comes from, either fiscal concerns or from a kind of Christian commitment to second chances. But they have been releasing prisoners, by the thousands in ways that liberals have not been doing. So, there are are still areas that we have to fight for racial justice. I believe in that. I think that's incredibly important, but it's also incredibly important to recognize that there are now partners across the aisle doing that. And so the people insisting that that is not the case, they're not doing so out of a commitment to reality or a commitment to racial justice. They're doing so out of a commitment to increasing their own share of power. So what is wokeness if it's not that? When I use the word woke, I'm using it the way sociologists have used it to refer to a very interesting phenomenon that happened around 2015. Pre-Trump, it's very important to point out, to where white liberal opinion when it comes to race outstripped, the public opinion of Black and Latino Americans in how extreme and academic it became when it came to issues of race. So let me give you an example. So Pew recently came out with a study, and one of the questions that they asked people was, do you believe that America's institutions are so racist that they must all be raised and rebuilt from the bottom up, something like that? So the over 91% of people who identified as progressives said yes to that. Progressives are the smallest of all of the subgroups of the Democratic side of this Pew study. Only 6% of Americans are progressive. It is also the whitest and the most highly educated. So the majority of Black Americans that were polled that in this study said no to that question. Should America's institutions be raised and rebuilt from the ground up? When you are saying something in the name of racial justice that the majority of Black Americans don't agree with, you can be pretty sure you're in woke territory. Defund the police, another great example. We desperately need police reform. The evidence suggests that the police insult Black Americans more, they lay hands on them more, they pull them over more, they arrest them more, and they beat them up more. They don't shoot Black Americans more than they shoot white Americans. They shoot poor Americans more than rich Americans. So that kind of is a misnomer in a lot of the coverage. But I mean, even if it was just insulting them, right? Even if it was just that a Black person could be reasonably sure that they were going to be insulted if they reached out to the police for help, I mean, that's a moral emergency that we have in this country right now. It's not woke to demand that we find some sort of solution to that, some way of addressing that. It's woke to demand that we defund the police, because that is a view that 81% of Black Americans oppose. Okay, so that's really the difference. So what is it really? So when I try to sort of analyze, like take a step back, it's not woke to demand that we have a more equitable public school system. New York's public schools are more segregated than Alabama's. It's woke to say that standardized testing is white supremacist, right? So what is it that makes white liberals, affluent white liberals, push these things that are at odds with the interests of the very Americans, the very Black Americans, Latino Americans they claim to be advocating for? So I think that it stems from this very academic way of seeing the world, where we've replaced kind of a worldview based on the difference between right and wrong with a worldview based on the difference between who has power and who doesn't. And then we've superimposed a racial binary onto that. So it's sort of, white people, white supremacy versus, people of color who are the victims of it. That's a very academic, it stems from, it starts with Hegel's master slave dialectic, went through the Marxian version, came to America, went through critical theory, critical race theory, and then you end up with that. That's been mainstreamed through the media as the media has become increasingly, affiliated with and made up of the elites, with that elite university degree, where essentially that's what you're being taught is this kind of postmodernist worldview. There's a lot there. I don't know if I answered your question completely, but
yeah, you totally did.
I don't want to filibuster. So.
No, you totally did. And that's so interesting. One of the things that I particularly, I'm trained as a historian, so I loved the part of your book that talked about how this happened and why. It is so convincing. So could you just go over that again?
Sure.
So I think you did explain really well where we are. How did we get there?
Yeah. So how did we get here? The argument I make in the book is that the moral panic we're in right now around race, and to a lesser degree gender, is not actually about race, and it's not actually about politics. It's about class. It's about the fact that the people setting the agenda for our nation are increasingly part of an overeducated elite that is benefiting from an enormous class divide in America that has elevated the fortunes of a meritocratic elite and has completely disastrous impact on the working class of all races. So working class Americans are on a downward spiral because of, both liberal and conservative kind of handshake agreement around free market stuff that ended up with, globalization, outsourcing of jobs, which was both parties were sort of doing this together. As the fortunes of the working class have sort of been in this downward spiral, the fortunes of highly educated elites, liberal elites in knowledge industry jobs have been on the rise, and journalism was swept up in that. So journalism used to be a working class trade. It used to be a very low status job that was, American journalism started as a revolution by and for the masses, the working class. So I write a lot about Joseph Pulitzer, whose motto on journalism was, nothing is worth printing that is not sure to be read by the masses. That was how American journalism got its start, as this complete populist revolt on behalf of the lower classes. And throughout much of the 20th century, journalism remained a working class profession. It was a blue collar job. Journalists lived in blue collar neighborhoods. They made maybe a little bit more than their neighbor, the factory guy, but not much more. Today journalists live in, Park Slope, and they make maybe a little bit less than their neighbor, the corporate lawyer. They've become part of the American elite. And that happened, due to a number of things that were both preventable and not preventable. So one of the things that caused this was the advent of television. It used to be a journalist's job to just go out there and report what they saw. But once television came around, it was a much more immediate way of doing that. And so there became a premium on interpretive journalism. You have to add something. You have to tell people what they're seeing, not just, you have to explain it to them. The Watergate scandal had a really big impact, not just the scandal itself, but the movie, All the President's Men. Suddenly journalism looked like a really glamorous endeavor, a bunch of sex pots like taking down a president, right? So before that, you had someone like JFK who worked on the Harvard Crimson when he was at Harvard, but he would never have dreamed of becoming a journalist because it was such a low status job, and he wanted to be famous. He wanted to be part of the elites, he wanted to rule the nation, right? After Watergate, people like JFK started to think about, well, maybe I'll become a journalist, right? That was another avenue to glamour. And so that started to, higher class people started to become journalists. They started asking for more money. That brought in even more high class people. With that added, that added interest, what publications started to do was increasingly to call to demand a college degree. So in 1937, less than half of the journalistic elites, the Washington cohort, had a college degree. Today, it's over 92% of journalists who have a college degree. It's one of the most overeducated industries in America. And then with digital media, that really amped it up even further. So you had the collapse of local news, which meant that, the majority of journalism jobs are in digital media, which are on the coasts. And, now you see increasingly the New York Times is getting it's where does it look when it's looking to hire? It goes to Vox, right? It doesn't go to some local paper where you have someone who maybe worked for someone who didn't have a college degree. It goes to a place where that's getting all of its talent from Harvard and Yale and Princeton and University of Chicago and, all of these very elite institutions. And we know also that places like the Times and the Washington Post and NPR, they take their interns basically only from the top 1% of universities. And so there's been just this the narrowing of the path. Like people often point out how white America's newsrooms are, and they are, and it's terrible. But the reason they're white is not because, the journalists hire them are racist. It's because you have to be rich to become a journalist, and America's rich are very, very white. So that's kind of the sad story of the decline and fall of this once robust, working class institution.
Right. And it rings so true to me that, it's also this class, this subclass of the elite that feels the need to justify, in a way, it's making less money than the corporate lawyer by we're doing good, so that it really does fit into the moral panic part of it, that in addition to the status that they're now sharing, they also need a sort of super status, which is, okay, we don't make quite as much money, but we're doing God's work. And woke ideology kind of lends itself to that. The other thing that I thought was great and interesting about this historical narrative was the business model shift. So can you talk a little bit about that, about how subscriptions used to drive journalism and how that changed?
Totally. So, You know, back in the day, most journalism was produced, you know, in the heartland, right? It was produced by, you know, by local journalists, you know, and they would get syndicated if they were very good. But, you know, every town had its paper, and it was before the great sorting. And so you would have these towns that had, like, you know, 60% Democrats and 40% Republicans, or the reverse. So a publisher, he had a choice, right? He could either sort of allow his journalists, which are, you know, journalists have always had that kind of pro little guy mentality, like, you know, so allow them to sort of pursue that and become, you know, this super lefty paper, but then he would be sacrificing 50% of potential customers. Or he could allow them, you know, to be super conservative, sacrifice the other half. Or you could, you know, they could insist you report the news straight and have opinions on both sides in the editorial pages, and that's how you get 100% of the subscribers. So that was really the model for a really long time. And what happened with digital media was kind of a reversal of that. So, you know, if once your success as a journalist was measured by, you know, how many people you could get to read your articles and respect them from across the spectrum, with digital media, the way that you make money is not through mass subscription, it's through what's called engagement. Engagement means how many people retweeted your story, how many people commented on Facebook, how many people shared it, how long you stayed on the page so that your data could be mined and then sold to a third party. And we know that the most engaged readers and viewers are always the most extreme. And so what you had very much by design, even at places like the New York Times, which is like supposed to be the pinnacle of journalistic integrity, was a kind of leaning into a business model that rewarded the desires of the most extreme readers, because that's where the revenue was coming from. The New York Times did this very, very intentionally. And that's how you ended up with a situation where 91% of New York Times readers are Democrats. I mean, it had to work really hard to squander its credibility to such a degree that so few Republicans could even read the news anymore, right? But that was very, very intentional. So I'll just give you an example. So in 2017, the data science team at the New York Times, they created a new way of attracting advertisers, let's say. They started to ask readers who were millennials, who were making, you know, over $100,000, $150,000 a year, to rate how articles were making them feel, to pick an emotion from a list of 18 emotions, and to say how they were feeling when they read this article and how much they were feeling. So they learned very quickly that the higher they ranked their emotional level, the longer they stayed on the page and the more likely they were to click on the ad, right? Okay, that's what Facebook realized a long time ago, right? The more emotional you are, the more you're going to engage. But they then took it one step further. They created a machine learning algorithm that could predict how a future article was going to make these highly desirable millennial heads of households making over $150,000 a year, how it was going to make them feel. And they now sell that to advertisers. So when Armani comes to the New York Times and says, hey, I want to buy a full page ad, here's my $100,000, the New York Times can say to them, great, how do you want the reader to be feeling when they encounter your ad, and how much do you want them to be feeling? They essentially monetized our emotions. This is the New York Times, right? Now they're very clear. They don't go to, you know, the journalists and say, look, you know, hey there, you know, we want to sell our money on ad. They want you to be feeling like, you know, angry with a soupçon of hope, you know, like, get me some copy on this, right? It doesn't work that way. But the thing is, they don't need to, because the same thing that makes the advertiser want to have their ad next to an article that makes the reader be feeling extreme emotions is what makes a journalist want, you know, to have their story go up on social media. They want a lot of people to share it. They want to get the opprobrium. They want AOC to retweet it, right? They want it to go to the top of the leaderboard. So what used to be a situation where you had journalists, okay, they were pulling slightly to the left, but the business was pulling them to the center. Now you have journalists pulling to the left and the business pulling in the same direction. And the thing is like what the New York Times realized was, you know, there were two things that really, really, really make affluent white liberals, who are their target audience, feel their emotions very, very, very strongly. And those things are Donald Trump and white supremacy, which is why you will see those words all the time in the New York Times. And I'll just end with this. In 2017, Donald Trump's name appeared 97,000 times in the New York Times, which is the equivalent of 4 times every single article, or once every 250 words, right? That was not from a journalistic motivation. That was because they had hacked our emotions, just like Facebook.
Wow, that's scary. Yeah. So So a couple of things that that make me think of. One of them is another thing that I really respected about this book is that there's so much Donald Trump is destroying the world, and I actually am among the people who think that he did some really bad things, especially to our institutions that were incredibly damaging and bad. But I like the way that your book pulls us back to think of him in part as a product instead of just
Mhm.
as the cause of the downfall of democracy. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. How do you see him as a symptom rather than just this terrible storm that rolled in, this evil man who's now single-handedly destroying democracy?
Yeah, so it's so funny because, his economic agenda, which we never talked about, there was like a taboo on discussing it, was actually extremely progressive. He was knocking things off what was Bernie Sanders' wish list from 2015. I'm talking about getting rid of NAFTA. I'm talking about securing the border. I'm talking about the trade war with China, tariffs. This was stuff that was considered too socialist to broach for the Democrats, right? And then you had this Republican making it happen. It was so interesting. Like beyond yeah, he was gross. Yeah, he would brawl. He was undignified. But beyond that, if you looked at the policy, there was so much that we just didn't understand was happening. We're not able to talk about. The Republicans couldn't talk about it because they hated this stuff because they believe in this trickle down crap. And the Democrats couldn't talk about it because they were not allowed to say anything nice about him. So no one talked about it. But I think you hit it on the head. So my argument in my book is that wokeness is an alibi for upper class, upper caste white liberals who see themselves as the good guys but are benefiting enormously from the class chasm and economic inequality and can't admit that to themselves. And so they've sort of moved the site of American inequality from class, from income to race at a time when Americans have never been less racist, to sort of distract from the real inequality that they're benefiting from. I argue that it's about class. And I think that that's what Trump was really about. And the reaction to him completely was about this. So the great awakening that I described in the beginning that happened in 2015, to where white liberals became more extreme in their views on race than Black and Latino Americans, that was the result of something that happened in the media in 2012. Again, this is not me saying this. This is sociologists have quantified this. They've trawled the archives of liberal outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and Vox, CNN, MSNBC. And what they found was starting around 2011, 2012, you saw an absolute skyrocketing of woke terminology. Words like white privilege, oppression, marginalization. The word marginalization next to people of color, right? Creating that unconscious link that people of color are somehow less powerful, have less agency, require our beneficence and our help to succeed, right? All of this really insulting, like stuff that's just endemic to how liberals think about the world. You started to see these words go like this, like an absolute, like, hockey stick, just skyrocketing, this obsessive talking about race and gender as well through a very academic lens that divides the world into that binary of powerful and powerless. Why was the media doing this? They were doing it because that's how digital media works, right? Exactly like why they use Donald Trump's name so often. They started to see that Google would pick up, articles that have these words and put it to the top of the list, and then more people would click on it. Like they started to understand that this was what the audience they wanted, affluent white liberals, were looking for in their articles. Now, that to me that is about class. Like that's not about race, because it was not reflecting the world we live in. It wasn't like 2011, 2012, suddenly there was like, skyrocketing instances of hate crimes. There weren't. It was a completely journalistic business end of things rationale that started to drive this kind of digital traffic. And then, 3 years later, liberal opinion had changed. White liberal opinion had literally changed to reflect the media's obsession with race from this very woke point of view. And to me, this is the great distraction from that's when it was really, we're talking about after 2008, right? After the great collapse, after all of these people who lost their homes, right? And the bailout of the banks, right? So there was this massive, massive like class chasm becoming really apparent. And instead of dealing with that, liberal media and the liberals that they were catering to leaned all in on this kind of racial question. And Trump was 100% a response to that. I mean, I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of Trump voters. All but one of them said to me, I wish he would stop with the tweeting. It's so undignified. It's so embarrassing, but I love what he's doing for the country. I love what I see in my bank account. They were not in it for the things we all found gross. They thought that was gross too, but they knew people who were killing themselves, literally committing deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism, opioid addiction. I mean, that was the number one predictor for whether a county would go to Trump, how many deaths of despair were in that county. He was literally a tribune for the forgotten America. And that doesn't undo how gross he was or how undignified he was or how much he delighted in offending, marginalized communities. He did all of that. I'm not praising any of that, but he made forgotten Americans, including many forgotten working class Black Americans and Latino Americans, feel seen after they had been abandoned by both parties. And so I see him very much as a product of the liberal establishment's abandonment of the working class. And then in response to them finally having a tribune, what did they do? They called all of them racist, right? If you started to say what I'm saying now, that Trump was a reflection of economic anxiety, that very phrase was termed a dog whistle, right? They literally used that to sort of legislate out of existence in polite society any discussion about economics.
Right. I mean, that's so interesting. And, whether or not Trump materially, I see some comments, he didn't actually help the working class. I don't know, to what extent, to some extent he did, maybe he didn't, but,
I can address that if they want actual data.
Yeah, I definitely do. But I take one of your points in the book as at least he wasn't sneering at
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And that to me is such a key point in your book too, that there is this attitude among these people that has infiltrated the media, that there's like this kind of basket of deplorables.
Yeah.
Like, shouldn't these people be natural allies if you call yourself a party of the left and are trying to create a big tent that covers different races and interests and so forth? It seems really crazy to then just turn around to the people who are the most desperate and say, you're just awful people, so you're not in our tent anymore.
Yeah, I would say I don't know that they're the most desperate. I think there is a level of desperation, but there is a difference between a working class agenda, a pro working class agenda, and a welfare agenda. The working class people don't want handouts. They don't want an expanded welfare state. They want good jobs with dignity. So there is a little bit of a tension there between a party that caters to the poor and a party that caters to the working class. I will also say there is evidence that Trump did help the working class. So in 2019, the bottom 25% of wage earners saw a 4.5% increase, which is like unheard of. There was historic levels of low levels of Black unemployment. Like, this stuff really matters. If Obama had done this stuff, we would never hear the end of it, and we would be talking it up as we should be. So I think there is that evidence. I will say something very funny is that people frequently say to me, oh, these are right-wing talking points. And I think that's such a funny thing to say. Like, first of all, I mean, you have to be a certain kind of progressive to think that it's literally an insult to be called a conservative. I don't think of myself as a conservative. I think I'm on the left, but I'm not insulted to be a conservative. But the reason I think I'm on the left is because I care about class and inequality. But when I talk about class and inequality, the left calls me a right winger. And to me, I'm like, really, you want to cede that ground? You want to say that it is now a right wing proposition to care about class and inequality? Like, you're throwing the game for your opponent, right? Like, that if the left is literally going to be the side that says actually to care about class is to be a conservative, then what do you care about? Like, if it's not inequality, like, what exactly makes you a leftist? What
Right.
makes you a liberal if you don't care about these things? So
Right.
whenever somebody says that to me, I think like, well, that's kind of a victory, right? You're sort of admitting that you've lost the plot, which is, the whole argument of my book. So
Right, exactly. There's another question from one of the viewers about the 24-hour news cycle and how
yeah.
it's affected this. And it raises a question that I had when I was reading your book too, which is what would you like the role of the media to be? So is the problem that they have respond, in the way that you were dystopian, like they can figure out what your emotions are, or is it that they're responding to the wrong people's emotions? In other words, if they were responding to the working class emotions and, they were still doing that, but they were figuring, this story, for instance, crime. Stories about crime are often in papers read by people who are more working class, and it does evoke certain emotions. And my guess is that's profitable for certain newspapers. But then the left wing, like media, just never covers crime. So how could you reimagine a media that played a socially responsible role? Would they have to go back would we have to go back to a time when it was a different business model, or is it possible to imagine it now?
The era that I look back on, with sort of nostalgia and jealousy, this sort of great populist era of, journalism that was really on the side of the working class. It was not nonpartisan at all. It was deeply partisan on behalf of the lower classes. And I think that partisan media is not a bad thing as long as everyone's represented. But what we have today is like what looks like a debate but is not a debate. We have, debate product, it's like cheese product. So we have like debate product, which is what you get between, Republicans and Democrats, where they both pretend that they're having this like massive debate when actually like they agree about the most important things, which is, free market economy that immiserates the working class, that everybody in America, we should all go to war all the time, like, and that they should be allowed to own, huge amounts of stocks, right? Like while serving the public, right?
Right.
Like on all of the important issues, they really agree. And even on economics, you have Republicans pushing this trickle down nonsense. Then you have Democrats pushing for an expanded welfare state, but neither of those is good for the working class, right? Like I was saying before, what the liberals want is to have, a welfare state that covers everybody who sort of makes, just below what they make, right? But essentially what you're doing then is robbing those people of autonomy, which is what they want. They don't want to live at your beneficence. They don't want to live on your handouts that can be taken away at any moment, right? They want the right to work and to have, autonomy over their lives. So, I forgot why I was talking about this.
Well, I was saying,
Oh,
what
partisan.
role
Yeah,
should the
yeah,
media
yeah, yeah,
play?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's important. It's important to say, there, instead of responding to an imagined voice of that you think the working class should want, you're saying there should be a media that's actually responding in part to the working class's true interests or how they view their own interests.
Yeah, and I think that, the Joe Rogan, brouhaha is very revealing, because the difference between Rogan and CNN, the major, major difference is he respects his audience enough to give them a choice and be like, you make up your own minds, and CNN is like, no, we're going to tell you what to do and you should listen to us, right? Like there's this very patronizing, they have huge amounts of contempt for their audience on the left. They don't trust them to make up their own minds. They don't trust them to hear opposing viewpoints. I mean, you remember what happened at the New York Times when Senator Tom Cotton dared to reflect the views of 60% of Americans and say, we should quell violent protests and riots with the military, a view I don't agree with, by the way. But, there was like literally, one person was fired, 2 people ended up leaving, 2 other people were demoted. Like it was disgusting. Like they literally can't, they are certain that if their viewers or audience are exposed to a view they disagree with, they will immediately assume that point of view like sheep, and B, no longer whatever. It's all so much contempt. And so I think like the role of the media should be not to have contempt for the working class. But I mean, I will, if there was like the New York Times and Fox News were like 2 out of like, 100,000 outlets, and the rest of them were catering to working class audiences, I wouldn't have a problem with that at all. The problem is that everything to the left of Fox is trying to get the same 10 million progressive, affluent, makes $250,000 for the family, lives in Park Slope audience. Like, they all want that same audience, and everybody else has been forgotten. And on the Fox side, they are actually catering to the working class. 75% of their viewers are working class, insofar as they don't have a college degree. There's also a lot of rich people who don't have a college degree who watch them, but but they're not catering to their economic interests. And so there's, as you said earlier, like I say in the book, like, at least they don't insult them while abandoning them economically, which is what you have on the left.
Right. That's so interesting. So I guess that's a good segue, or at least I see a good question. That's a good segue into, is it good for the Jews? Which, we are the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. So people are asking about that. And, there's this one scene, I think it's toward the end of your book, where you're talking about, I think it was the head of the Women's March. Am I right? And she said something to the effect that the Jews are particularly responsible for the oppression of Black and brown people. Am I right? If some statement to like that was considered, anti-Semitic, or at least was viewed as anti-Semitic. So I don't know. I take that part of your book where you say, okay, the real losers of this, the real people who have lost out, the casualty of wokeness taking over the media, is the working class. But the second group, or at least a second, maybe a distant second, are Jewish people. So I wonder if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I see that Charles Jacobs in the chat is trying to get me in trouble here.
Yeah.
These are good questions. So I definitely think Jews are not the biggest, I call it woke roadkill, like the biggest woke, the biggest people who are, essentially paying the price for wokeness. I mean, I would say really are, the descendants of slaves, the ones, living in the inner city, who have really been forgotten by, liberals, purported attempts to represent them. So people of color, Black Americans, working class Americans, Asian Americans, these are all the people who have been really, really impacted by wokeness. Jews as well, but I am a person who's very against kind of hysteria around anti-Semitism. Like, I think we are the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth. I say this all the time. Like, anti-Semitism is rising. It's on the rise. It's very bad. But, the only Jews like luckier than us was us 5 years ago, before anti-Semitism started to rise. And we're going to get back there. We will get back there. And, some of it is rising because of wokeness. Some of it is rising because of the far right. But I really feel like, we should not lose sight of the fact that, this country has been incredibly good to our people. We now have another country. If things go south, it has the 17th most powerful army in the world. So, the thing we lived with as Jews, like, I think my parents, even growing up, could not have imagined how safe they would feel, at this time. So, but at the same time, yeah, wokeness has come for Jews. Jews are considered to be white because, a lot of us are, have white skin. And so we're not considered, we're considered to be proximate to whiteness. And so, we are no longer considered to be a minority that is deserving of protections, even though we are still on the receiving end of racism all the time, whether it's from, young Black kids beating up Hasidim in Brooklyn, or whether it's, the Squad making, gross comments about Israel that end up with, Jews getting beaten up by pro-Palestinian, protesters, or whether it's, Richard Spencer and Unite the Right rally and, the attacks in Poway and in Pittsburgh, right? We're still on the receiving end of racist violence. I will say, when it comes to anti-Zionism, it's like a little bit more complex, because I think anti-Zionism is essentially sort of wokeness Middle East edition. Like, I think it's malarkey, but I don't think it's inherently anti-Semitic. I have very, very deep connections in the Palestinian community. I think it's immoral to expect Palestinians to be Zionists. And so to brand their view that they wish Israel didn't exist, which is a perfectly reasonable view, if you are the one paying the price for it, if you're living under occupation or under blockade or in a Syrian refugee camp, God forbid, like that to call that bigotry, I think is immoral. At the same time, when, the squad, starts accusing Israel of genocide, like that's untrue. Their view is like stupid and wrong. And even though it's not anti-Semitic, it led to violence against Jews. So at some point, it's like, is this a distinction without a difference? I don't know. I'm not quite there yet, but I talk a lot about that in the book in the section about Jews. There's a question, have I ever talked to anyone out of being woke? I have been talked out of being woke, Charles. I was very woke for a long time. And I can go into how that happened. But I was talked out of it. I have very good friends who are woke, who I really respect being in conversation with. I have a friend who I see shifting her opinions about things. We get into these blowout fights, and but then we're in it for the long haul. And so I don't know if that's talking her out of being woke or screaming together. Myself, there's tears, there's whatever, but I would say. I think I have like 1.5 success stories under my belt, but I am a big success story. And I think that, people don't change their mind based on information. They change their mind based on whether they know somebody who they can respect, who has a view that they disagree with. So I think that's, I could go into that more if it's interesting, but I'm sure you have other questions, Rebecca.
Well, no, I mean, I actually think that's really interesting. I like Charles's question. Sorry to make you answer it, but it's not, I think, religious Jews. I don't think religious Jews are disproportionately woke. I think it's largely secular Jews who are disproportionately
Yes.
woke.
The thing is, I have seen people say that in a way that sounds really anti-Semitic, like, oh,
No.
the Jews are woke. But I respect Charles' question. I'll tell you why Jews are disproportionately woke. Liberal Jews are disproportionately woke because they're very progressive and they are overeducated and they live on the coast and they are in that affluent liberal elite. Like, if wherever you find those, if they are disproportionately represented, in Harvard and in Yale and in Princeton and on the Upper West Side and at Los Angeles, like, that the wokeness is a socioeconomic signifier. So in Europe, right, in England, right, my dad's from England, and you can tell by someone's accent, within 20 miles where they grew up and with the 90% certainty how much money their father made, right? We don't have accents here. So instead we have the word Latinx, right? That's how you signal your belonging to an upper crust, right? You signal that you went to an elite university by saying this stupid word that nobody who's actually Latino would ever dream of using. I think it's 2% of Latinos use Latinx. It's a way of signaling social belonging to an upper crust. And to the extent that Jews are overrepresented in like the liberal elites, they are going to be overrepresented as having those woke views. So I would say that that's really the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's historically how Jews were accused of being both the captains of industry and the communists.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
You can't win. You're on both sides of
Right.
this divide, and it seems like the exact same thing is going on here. So I see why you would be reluctant.
Yeah. I don't want to be like
that, but it is
Jews are leading the wokeness, right? Because of course, like that, the whole term cultural Marxism was created by an anti-Semite, right?
Yeah.
Although it is a very, those people actually call themselves cultural Marxists as well. I will say, like you're right, you don't see any of this in the Orthodox community. I do think that liberal Jewish America, to the extent that it is falling prey to wokeness, to the extent that you see Jews saying things like we are upholding white supremacy, is in a state of deep moral crisis. There's just a huge crisis of moral authority in the Jewish community right now. And I really respect all that you guys are doing to push back against that, because I can't think of something that's more, it's so important. And it's just so devastating to see things like, the chief rabbi of the Reform movement call an academic racist for publishing, a study that found that there were fewer Jews of color than some advocacy group had found. Like, the leader of 2 million American Jews, like to smear an academic as racist for doing academic work that just didn't find the same finding as somebody else. Like that's moral crisis right there. And everybody
totally
has to push back against that.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that I thought of, so I'll just say one of them. The first one is a question, which is, if wokeness is leading to an increase in anti-Semitism, not one that you're panicking about, not one that I'm panicking about, but an increase. And there's also a form of right-wing nationalism that seems to have that same tenor. Not all nationalism, but there's a strain of it. What like what should we look to as a safe way of seeing ourselves in the world? Is it humanism? Is it nationalism? Is it localism? Is it what Zionism? I mean, what is the ideology that is the most secure for Jews?
So I am a nationalist, I would say. I
Yeah,
believe
same.
deeply, deeply in this nation that has been so good to us and is learning to be good to everybody else. And I feel deeply embedded in the fabric of American society and deeply committed to the American project. I mean, it's of course it's great to know that Israel exists if, things go south here, but I grew up in Israel. I went to high school in Israel and I chose to live here, and I choose to live here because I feel that this is where I belong and this is my nation. And I feel such a privilege to be an American Jew, to be American and to be Jewish and to be part of this, you know, um amazing country. So to the, like I'm going to go down with this ship, and so I feel like I feel very to the extent that things are going badly in America, that's the extent to which things are going badly for me. And so I think that we should all be very committed to that. And I think part of the problem with some of the Jewish institutions today is that they think that you kind of fight anti-Semitism by calling strikes and balls, right? I don't actually know what that means. I think that's a sports metaphor, but that's what they call it. I don't know anything about sports, but that's not the way you fight anti-Semitism is by building up this nation and stitching the fabric of our society together here and committing to your fellow Americans and to loving your fellow American, whether or not you agree with them about issues. Like, can't believe people would let a president come between them. I wrote this story during the Trump years about a church that it had been two churches. It had been a white evangelical church and it had been a historically black church. And they merged together in 2016 after Trump was elected to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth. And every single one of those white people voted for Trump and every single one of those black people voted for Hillary Clinton. And they couldn't care less. And the black pastor Derek Hawkins, I just worship him. He changed my life. I'm so close with him now. He said to me, I think if I allow an administration to come between me and a person of another race, that lacks maturity. And it's like such an obvious point, but it's like that. I mean, that's how we protect ourselves, is by committing to that. Like that is, being that bridge.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I was so happy you picked nationalism because I do feel like part of where the left went wrong in recent history is abandoning the idea of a progressive notion of what America is and ought to be, for this kind of it's evil, to its very bones, which it just doesn't work. Okay, so one other thing I want to talk about is because it's central to the mission of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values is open dialogue and the way in which, because you were just mentioning that this ability to engage with people who aren't like you or don't have the same exact views as you. And I know that you had worked at the Forward and had some issues with mentioning that there should be more diverse Black voices heard in the Jewish community and also in the broader liberal community that have been kind of blocked out. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I came to the Forward, the opinion pages had been sort of in the kind of safe, liberal Zionists, even my mic doesn't want safe liberal Zionism, in that kind of safe, liberal Zionist mode. And, I felt very strongly that we had to hear from all sides. And that we should be expanding to the left and expanding to the right, and that we needed, intellectual diversity, that we needed racial diversity, that we needed to hear from Palestinians and from Muslims and from settlers and from everybody whose voices are relevant to our community within limits, of course. Like, for example, before running a settler, I would always call them on the phone and talk about, what they see as, the end goal, right? If the end goal was, Palestinians should have no civil rights, I wouldn't run them, right? But many of them, you'll be surprised to learn, you can read them in the Forward. Don't think that. So, that I always took that as my mandate, like that we have to represent the full breadth of legitimate opinion relevant to the community. And, there was pushback from both sides from the get-go. At first, I think the left was very excited because they thought they would have a champion in me, because I am left. I'm very left on many issues, including on Israel. And then every time I would run somebody on the right, there would be just this immense pushback. I would instantly get called racist. And, I was so shocked. Like, I'd say, don't you want them to read your opinions? Like, don't you want them reading your op-ed? Like, that's how you do it, right? You read theirs, they read yours. Everybody reads each other's, right? And I think that, specifically, we have a problem today where people have replaced intellectual diversity with racial diversity. But it's even worse than that because, for example, in the Black community, it is a very intellectually diverse community. I mean, there's just, opinion is so rich. The arguments, the debates around race, around everything are so rich, around patriotism, around what it means to be an American, around immigration, right? You would never know this because there's only sort of one type of, marginalized person that's allowed through to the New York Times, to CNN, to MSNBC. And it's really, increasingly people who sort of hew to this woke view. And so, now at Newsweek, I'm really blessed because they've totally given us the freedom to just host, radical debates. And we really have a premium right now on, working class voices, on people from, marginalized communities who you would never hear from otherwise, who actually represent their communities much better. Although, like I said, these communities are really diverse, and, accurately reflecting that is. And also, I just want to tell you, the relief people feel when they see their views represented in your pages, like that's such a rewarding thing, to have somebody, writing about, like, why he as a Black man is going to the March for Life, is that what it's called? The abortion, the anti-abortion, because, he was, the product of a woman who was being encouraged to have an abortion and decided not to. And, or just like having people who truly represent, where their community, the 50-yard line of their communities are at. It gives people reason to come back. And I think that's really important. So I would say, like, yeah, that's, I'm very lucky that that's my job, but you really need cojones, especially, in a Jewish community that's increasingly, sort of under the sway of this kind of woke mentality. It got harder and harder.
Yeah, well, your book is really doing a lot, I think, to promote these conversations. And as I started with, I just walked around this beach resort with your book, and all of a sudden I was having all of these conversations with people who, I think we're just wanting to be able to talk, and we're afraid to talk to most people. But because my book
Wow.
said woke, they were like, oh, I
That's
guess I can talk to them, which is
amazing.
amazing.
I
It
love
is.
that.
Totally. So I guess, we're running
I
out
will
of
also just say, people who are scared to walk around with a book that has woke on it, the cover comes off.
time.
And so you can walk around with a book that just looks like this if you prefer.
Right.
And my mom, who's
Like, that's what people used to do with their Playboys. They would just like
exactly. And the author photo, I'm sleeveless in it, which I forgot when I sent them the photo. My mother's a very observant Jew, and
oh,
so
no.
she has been taking off the cover so that she can share it with
Different
friends
reasons.
of hers. Yes.
That's funny. So I don't know. I feel like I'm an optimistic person. I get that sense from you too, about a
Totally.
lot of things. But how do you do you think that this has taken hold in a way that is impervious to a kind of unraveling, or do you see a slow movement in the other direction?
Well, I think we're very much in correction mode. I think the mask is off. And I think that you're seeing a number of things. One is you're seeing Trump's populist economic agenda being picked up by folks like Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley, and they're making a play for the working class on economic grounds. Like, I don't care which side is going to represent the working class as long as someone is. So that's
Right.
something that's like, if they're going to increasingly go on Fox News and bash Amazon for the way it treats its workers, as opposed to just for being too woke, that's great. You know what I mean? If they're going to convince, Marco Rubio recently told me in an interview that there's a big gap between the Republicans' donor base and its voter base. And Trump exposed that gap. I think that's 100% true. And to the extent that they're going to be leaning into the voters as opposed to the donors, I think that's great. the Democrats right now are clearly leaning into the donors instead of the voters, which is why they're going to, get slaughtered in the midterms, how they lost Virginia, right? Because, middle class, working class people, like, they're not down with the woke agenda,
They are not.
So, yeah. So I think that, and I think that there is, the week after the Virginia election, like, that was the one time I was allowed on CNN because I think they were sort of in free fall. They were like, how did this happen? And I was like, well, it's like predicted in my book, like, obviously this is what's going to happen. And then of course they went back into it and now they're totally imploding for other reasons. But I think that there is, the Fox News right now gets more viewers than MSNBC and CNN combined. And Tucker Carlson, who's the only person on mainstream TV who will talk about class at all, is the third most watched show by Democrats. Okay. They're not all hate watching. Like, they're seeing something that is resonating with them. And I think that the liberal media is going to wake up. But I also don't think it's important that they do. Like, I think we should all just be tuning it out. I think we've replaced spirituality and community with information and knowledge. It's the same reason that people in knowledge industry jobs make so much more money than working class Americans. And I think people should just tune out. Like, there's nothing you can learn from the New York Times or CNN that you can't learn from going to a synagogue or from the local bodega, like, we should just tune them out. Consumer boycott, man.
Right. Back to the point about 24-hour, part of the thing about 24-hour news and Twitter is that you get addicted. Like, you start to feel like you need to have the most, recent thing. My mother would call because she'd like watch something on CNN. I'd be like, oh yeah, I saw that like 7 hours ago because I said, but like, why? Why?
I know, totally.
Yeah. But anyway, all right. Well, this has been like so much fun. And I've learned so much from your book and just talking to you. So thank you
so much, Rebecca. Yeah. This is amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you to all the people who have been watching and asking such interesting and challenging questions. Appreciate that as well.